And okay, where was I, you guys? I got a phone call. I'm really sorry, but here we go again. So the secret ballot, they get that done. The progressives, progressives like Bob La Follette, fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, took on the powers that be, took on his political parties. He himself was a Republican, but he, challenged the kind of party system. He promoted the direct election of senators. He promoted initiative, referendum, and recall. All kinds of political reforms. Here he is again fighting Bob La Follette. So yeah, the progressives are doing a lot in a lot of areas. Labor reform, things like child labor. I mean, if you're an advocate of child labor, I guess you're probably not going to like the progressives, because they began to say, no, I think we need some laws. I think 9-year-olds should not be in the mines or the mills or the factories, like the Spinner girls here down in Richmond, Virginia, working in the cotton mills. Yeah, she looks like she can't be much older than 8. And I've got other pictures in other presentations of children working, but it wasn't just children, it was also women. In your book there's a discussion of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and these kind of horrific labor conditions that existed were going to be challenged by many progressive reformers who began to say we need some regulation in the workplace. Another place where they began to challenge, actually, sorry, okay, urban reform, got it. Okay, we're in the cities. I thought I had consumer advocacy next, but we'll wait on that. Okay, the cities, cleaning up the cities, cleaning up garbage like Jane Addams does in Chicago, cleaning up immigrant neighborhoods, getting sanitation and basic city infrastructure operating, and wresting it from the control of party bosses and corrupt officials, and helping the people. This is something that progressive reformers like Jane Addams wanted to do in Chicago, and she helped establish a movement, the Settlement House movement in Chicago, which spread to all the cities of the country, where settlement house workers, middle-class reformers, sought to help immigrant communities, poor communities, in many, many ways, and again, including conditions where people lived and worked, like in these tenement sweatshops, which were just kind of, could be horrible, crowded, exploitative types of places. This is a captivating image from Jacob Riis with this 12-year-old boy, right, pulling threads in this sweatshop in 1889, looking like he's been bruised and beaten. There were just a lot of poor conditions, kids. And again, yes, Jacob Riis is probably staging this or something, but definitely it reflected the nature of poor immigrant neighborhoods in large urban and industrial areas. And people like Jane Addams began to try to confront the boss system, the political machines that were controlling America's cities, and try to get them to function better. Other reformers focused upon pure food and drug legislation. Was our food safe? We're becoming a big urban industrial nation. We're not raising our own pigs anymore. We're eating food bought in larger stores coming from further afield on trains and things like that. Slaughterhouses in Chicago. What were the conditions like? Well, Teddy Roosevelt reads this novel called The Jungle, and it talks about the horrific conditions that exist in slaughterhouses in Chicago, and he's appalled. And after that, he begins to promote pure food and drug legislation. I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Purity reform is another area that progressive reformers focused upon. Reforms like temperance and prohibition, which prohibition is going to be passed, of course, by constitutional amendment in 1920, as I already mentioned. And this idea was, to confront the the evil of alcohol consumption and all the attendant evils that it helped to create, the exploitation of children and women, domestic violence, poverty, all kinds of immorality is going to be fostered in the minds of Puritan reformers, progressive reformers, by alcohol consumption. Conservation and preservation is another one of those reforms promoted by the progressives. So if you like nature, and if you don't like your nature looking like this, but you like your nature looking like this, and you like national parks, well, you might thank the progressives, because it was progressive presidents like Teddy Roosevelt who really created the national park system and our system of national forest. Here's Teddy Roosevelt standing with John Muir at Yosemite Falls in California. Yosemite National Park, one of the great national parks created by Roosevelt. You can see the time frame. Things like Crater Lake, also created during this time. Mount Rainier, right around this time. 1900s, teens, 20s, and beyond, we see the creation of all of these national parks. Teddy Roosevelt, as president, did a lot to aid the progressive cause. So again, here the question is, success or failure. What I'm doing here is not trying to say one thing or another. I'm giving you fuel, I'm giving you ammunition to say one thing or another, and you can run with it any way you want. Right now I'm trying to show you, well, what did the progressives accomplish? And even with those accomplishments, you might argue that it was unsuccessful in doing A, B, or C. I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So I've just given you a vast array of reforms and reform efforts that progressives promoted. Now let's focus on the two most famous progressive presidents of the era, Teddy Roosevelt first, and then Woodrow Wilson. So here's Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, the activist president who uses the bully pulpit to promote numerous reforms. In 1902, for example, he uses the power of the presidency to break up the Northern Securities Company, which was deemed a monopoly and in restraint of trade. And he uses the Sherman Antitrust Act here and in about 25 other instances to break up large entities, large trusts, which he felt were getting too big and not working in the public interest. We should note that Roosevelt did not believe all trusts were bad. Your book explains how he believed there were good trusts and bad trusts, and he just wanted the trusts to operate in the interests of the people. And if they didn't, he was quite willing to use his executive authority and use the power of the presidency and the Justice Department and so forth to attack those trusts. He helps to promote and to ferry through Congress some important pieces of legislation which he signs, like the Elkins Act, which restricted government rebates, the giving of rebates to railroad companies. There was the Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act, again regulating railroad rates and strengthening and restoring the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission. So Roosevelt was looking to level the playing field, to use government as a force against large corporations, including in the area then of pure food and drug legislation. He was the guy who got the Pure Food and Drug Act passed, the creation of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the Meat Inspection Act passed of 1906, which then simply meant there's got to be some government regulation. So Roosevelt is promoting this idea that the government can work in the interest of the people as a kind of watchdog against an entirely unregulated, laissez-faire industrial system. And that in itself is a controversial idea, because some people, again, still argue today, oh, well, we're better off if we have absolutely no regulation. Well, Roosevelt didn't think so, and he was a Republican at the turn of the century. He lived in a different world than us, of course. Today, we have a world that's regulated far beyond what the progressives did. So we come from a different perspective, but if you look at it from their perspective, things needed to be done, and certainly they did them. Let's look at what Woodrow Wilson did, because he by far exceeded Roosevelt in terms of getting things done that aided the progressive movement. he was the one, it was during him that Congress and then the states passed through the constitutional amendment, the income tax, which he supported. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt also had supported it as well. It was Wilson who oversaw and promoted and advocated and saw pass through Congress the Federal Reserve Act, which created a Federal Reserve System. Here's the Federal Reserve districts, which meant that the government for the first time would really be controlling our banking system more thoroughly than they had up to that point. In fact, you could argue that there really was not even an actual common currency in our country until 1913. I mean, yes, the dollar was the basic currency, but states could still do other things until 1913, when you've got the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve banks, and we begin to use monetary policy to raise and lower interest rates, to regulate the amount of money that's in circulation, which has a lot to do with things like inflation and deflation. This again could be looked at as a positive or not. You see, most economists will say this has been a positive. We have had far less boom and bust, believe it or not, in the 20th century than we did in the 19th. There's more stability to our monetary system now because of the Federal Reserve System and government control and the Federal Reserve Board and things like that. We can control things much better. Other people say, no, this has been really bad. It's led us away from, a gold standard, a sound money standard, and it actually led to things like the Great Depression, and some people would even argue the financial collapse of 2008. That's a big argument that's out there. That if you want to wade into it, it's pretty deep. So be wary, but just know that that these arguments are out there. Wilson helped to create the Federal Trade Commission, which regulated trade across the states. The Clayton Antitrust Act, which bolstered up the federal power to enforce antitrust legislation. The creation of workmen's compensation passes in 1916 with Wilson's signature, something for the working man, and the first time we have national child labor legislation is the Keating-Owing Act, the first time as a nation we begin to restrict the use of child labor. There's an Adamson Act, which passes as an 8-hour day for federal employees, and maybe for railroad workers. I can't remember on that. I'd have to look that up now, and I don't have my notes in front of me. But in any case, the Adamson Act is the first time the federal government's coming out and saying we need to regulate the length of the workday. This isn't going to happen generally in the private sector until 1938 and the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So we actually don't have as a nation an 8-hour day and overtime and all that stuff until 1938. But this is the beginning of that, the progressive era. The Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916 is the very beginning of the federal government helping to stabilize the agricultural sector with farm subsidies. So there's a whole bunch of stuff to tell you about things that got done, progressive legislation in all areas of American life. So, I guess just in terms of getting stuff done, the progressives were pretty successful. Whether you think it worked or not, or whether you think it went in the right direction or not, that's up to you and the way that you want to argue. Let me throw in, though, a little bit going the other way of questioning, what were the limits of progressivism? Where did it potentially fail, or did it achieve all the things that it set out to do? Did they really diminish corporate power? I think that's a pretty good question. I mean, corporations are less powerful today than they were at the turn of the century. I don't think so. Corporations have gotten bigger and more powerful in spite of these attempts to regulate them, in spite of anti-monopoly legislation and such. Did the progressives actually expand democracy for all? They certainly expand democracy for some women. That's nearly half of the population. Of course, black women in the South would be excluded from that, who couldn't vote. But if you look at it in other ways, and here's voter participation in 13 southern states from the period of the late 19th century to 1912, what you see here is that voting rates are actually not going up. Voter participation is not going up. So there's a weird thing that's happening during the progressive era, and that is that at the very same time that progressives are arguing that they're expanding democracy to reach more people, fewer people are actually going to the polls themselves and voting and participating. Some historians have said this is a function of the fact that the progressives were breaking up the political machines in the big cities that they saw as corrupt. But the political machines in the big cities actually helped to encourage voter participation in politics. And that once the machines disappear and the progressive type of reform puts government more in the hands of experts and bureaucrats and people who have training and things like that, that people begin to, let government do for them and rather than taking it in their own hands. So you have this declining political participation rate. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is some people say, well, maybe people were satisfied. You don't vote if you're satisfied. You do vote if you're angry and you want to change things. So maybe the progressives were just, satisfying more voters, and so fewer people were voting. I mean, this is just saying there are less people voting. We don't really know why, right? Progressives are certainly increasing the amount of bureaucracy. We do know that. We also must ask the question about race and race relations. The progressives operate in an era of entrenched racism, an era of segregation in the South and really all over the country. Jim Crow laws that treat whites and blacks differentially, the United States under no compulsion to force states to recognize the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that says, hey, you've got to treat all people the same. And the progressives, none of them really show much of a concern for African Americans. Of course, there are African American progressives. We can say that people like W.E.B. Du Bois and so forth are advocating for them themselves, but did Roosevelt advocate for them? Did Wilson advocate for them? No, not at all. And I think I already mentioned this earlier, didn't I, right? That they refused to even stand up for anti-lynching legislation. So there are different ways you can argue this question. You want to look at for whom, are we asking the question? For whom was progressivism good, and for whom was it not good, and how do you measure what success or failure is? You can do that any way you want. I'm going to stop now. I've gone on long enough. I've talked as fast as I can, and I've tried to give you some food for thought. Hope it was helpful. Good luck on your discussion. We'll talk to you later.